I always considered myself a happy man. I was from a good family, lived in Bucharest with my Labrador Elena, and attended a good school. I even had a girlfriend. But my father's death changed something and brought up nightmares I had only ever imagined. I don't consider myself happy anymore, because I know what waits for me in the darkness. I know. I've seen him. My father died right before my mother's 54th birthday. She joked he couldn't come up with a present for her and decided it was just easier to give up. She had a wicked sense of humor, my mother, and she largely used it to get over my father's passing. Even at his wake, she joked. But even if she blamed his lacking ability to purchase gifts, she knew the real cause of his death. He had never cared about his health, drank a lot, ate enough red meat to exterminate an entire race of cows, and smoked like an industrial-sized chimney. Safe to say, no one was particularly shocked when he passed away from a heart attack. Your father was the greatest man at office functions, his coworker Patrick told me as I sipped a cup of boiling hot coffee. My father had already been covered by dirt, and my mother's piping hot coffee and tea filled her home with traditional scents. I had at this point lost track of all the "I'm sorry for your loss, here's a casserole" wives of our community had exchanged with me. "I can imagine," I said, trying hard to cover the exhausted tone of my voice. "He knew how to party, I'm sure." Patrick laughed softly and looked down at his shoes. "He sure did. The office will be empty without him. Now who's gonna have the ponytail? I'll have to grow my hair out." Patrick joked tamely, letting his hand travel over the complete lack of hair across his crown. My father's thick black ponytail was a common joke. When he started working construction in the early 60s as a teenager, he had already had it. As he rose through the ranks to become a mid-level associate at the company he worked for, his hair was kept the same way through it all. "You'll have quite the shoes to fill," I laughed, as pleasantly as I could, catching my mother's eye from across the room. My phone vibrated, and I instantly recognized the name on the screen. Alina had sent me a message. My heart still fluttered, and I was thankful no one could see things like that. I felt like a schoolgirl with a crush, even though I was 22 years old. "How are you holding up? Get any good food?" She never used emoticons. I found it charming, but decided to wait until the wake was over to reply. I returned to my conversation with Patrick, sipped my coffee, and tried hard not to think about why he was here. The changes to my mother's appearance weren't instant. She had always been a bit pale, often sickly-looking or frail. With her thin frame, it took even longer before I took notice. On Tuesday, a full week after my father's wake, I finally asked her, "Mom, are you feeling all right?" I knew what the answer would be before I even asked her. She smiled at me weakly and stroked my head as she stood to grab the coffee pot. "I'm just tired, darling." The lie was obvious. She had lost weight in just a week, enough weight for me to notice. Her cheeks were hollow and her eyes sunken. She might have been tired, but it looked like she hadn't slept for weeks on end. I worried. Of course I worried. I had only recently lost my father, and I thought she might be getting something dangerous. Cancer, I thought, remembering the look of my grandmother, barely recognizable, as she passed away before our eyes, slowly through the process of chemotherapy. But my mother insisted she was fine. I still think it was denial, because of course father had told her, just like he had told Patrick. Patrick claimed he just wanted to check in on us, but I know why he really came 3 weeks later. Wednesday was a dry day, so dry that the summer air seemed not to be breathable. No wind, no clouds, nothing. I sat out on the porch as Patrick arrived, waving at my mother through the kitchen window as he made it up the path towards our door. His face turned into an expression of concern, and he sat down onto the porch next to me. Elena played in the grass, chasing a soccer ball around the yard. "Your mother is sick," Patrick simply stated, without as much as a hello first. I simply nodded my head. "She refuses to see it. I tried talking about going to a doctor yesterday, but..." I sighed and shook my head. "No doctor is going to help her," Patrick grunted and took off his hat. His bald head reflected the sunlight as he turned to me. "What do you mean? You mean it's grief?" I asked stupidly. Even when grieving, no one loses weight that rapidly. Not naturally, anyway. "Did your father ever..." Patrick stopped and gazed towards the road, thinking for a while before starting over. Did your father ever talk to you about strigoi? I laughed a little bit. The strigoi, the walking undead, were a common legend in Romania. Of course I had heard of them. Not from my father, but in general. The bodies of dead men straining away from their graves at night to prey on their close ones until they perish. The inspiration for the modern Dracula. No, but I know what they are. Why? I asked, suspicion coating my voice. I knew better by now than listening to old children's tales. Your father, he began, drawing a heavy breath and sighing. He told me once that your family had been cursed. 9 generations ago, he said, a man on your father's side had lain with a witch. As he was a married man, it was quite the scandal when she later became pregnant and claimed he had fathered the child. Your ancestor lied to her, to his wife, to the entire village, and said the child wasn't his. That the harlot had probably slept with half the village at that point. Of course, the witch was laughed out of the village, as your ancestor standing with the mayor made him a trustworthy man in the villagers' eyes. As revenge, the witch cursed your ancestor. She foretold that for 11 generations, every man passing away in that line would turn a day after his burial and come back to haunt whomever closest to him, and devour everyone he had ever made a connection with, no matter how meaningless. Even a good conversation would be enough. The relentless hunger of the strigoi would drive your entire family into the ground. Your father claimed that he was the 10th generation of the cursed, and once he died, he would turn undead and come for you and your mother. And by extension, me and his co-workers, our families, anyone ever touched by his presence. Patrick sighed heavily. I have known your father for 40 years. He was an idiot in every sense of the word, but he was an honest idiot. He was the worst liar I had ever met. You could always tell instantly. When he told me about his family's curse, there wasn't a single sign of lies on his face. I always knew when he lied. Always. I shook my head quietly. I'll admit the thought of the symptoms my mother exhibited, being a perfect match to those caused by a strigoi, had struck me before this conversation. But of course I had dismissed it. I still wanted to dismiss it now. But Patrick and my father had shared a key characteristic. They were both terrible liars. Patrick's left eyebrow always twitched, a tell every poker player would spot from miles away. I studied his face for a long time. Not a single muscle moved, involuntarily or otherwise. His face was calm, as if he knew I'd believe him. I'll be damned if he wasn't right, too. I believed him. Crazy as it might sound, and as insane as I may be, I understood that he'd never lie to me or joke about me and my mother's safety like this. I also knew that the speed of the strigoi would only increase once it had begun feeding on the life of my mother, consuming her inside and out. If it had already been going on for several weeks, she might die tonight. I believe you. I knew you would, kid. Patrick smiled softly, without the happiness reaching his eyes. They displayed the same somber sadness that had filled them every time I've seen him after my father passed away. Like he'd always known it had to come to this. Which, of course, he had. You know what we have to do now, don't you? He asked me softly. I nodded. The legends were clear. The only way to stop the rampage of a strigoi. A nail to the forehead, exactly between the eyes, and a burial face down. I know, I mumbled and thought of the sleep I would no doubt be missing. Patrick got up and walked down the path, not turning around to look at me. His limp had only gotten worse over the years, and I fought the instinct to help him. I'll pick you up tonight, 2 o'clock sharp. Don't be late, son. Our lives might just depend on it, he shouted as he rounded the corner, disappearing from sight. The graveyard around us seemed oddly calm considering the actions we were planning. I had somehow expected for someone to come stop us because they knew about our plans, that it would know, but the gravestones stood silent and the shadows were unmoving in the calm air the night offered me and Patrick as the gate squeaked open. Are you sure about this? I asked one final time as I pushed the gate closed behind us. The gravel beneath his feet complained as Patrick shifted to look at me. I trusted your father more than any other man I've ever known. He warned me about your mother dying, and she's already looking like a ghost. There's nothing more to it. We have to turn him. He started towards the mound of dirt that covered my father's grave, shovel already in hand. I felt sick to my stomach as I looked on the pile, and I wondered for what must have been the 100th time if I really wanted to do this. But Patrick's resolute steps echoed towards me from further down the path, and I decided to follow him. My hand shook as I gripped the handle of my shovel. It didn't take long before my arms trembled with the effort, blisters formed on my fingers, and everything seemed to burn. It looked so easy in the movies, digging up a grave, but soon my back was covered in a thin layer of sweat and I was out of breath. Patrick groaned beside me and dragged the back of his hand across his face. And then, my shovel hit wood. Patrick's large hand scooped the final layer away from the black, matte surface of the casket. "Are you ready for this?" Patrick asked, concern coating his eyes. I brushed dirt from my face and nodded, steeling myself for the sight of my dead father laying in front of me. But as the casket creaked open, I saw something more horrifying. It was empty. Only a few specks of dirt rested where my father's face must have been. "If I ever doubted you," I muttered into the empty air. I switched my gaze to Patrick's pale face. We both knew, in that instance, that there was only one place my father's wandering corpse would be. We had to get home to my mother. I laid back against the pillows of my parents' bed. My heart beat as if I was running, and I saw black spots in the white ceiling. The pained cry of what some might think was a hurt coyote flew across the city, but it comes as a surprise to no one. There are no coyotes in Bucharest. I knew the plan. I knew how many holes it had. My mother was hiding downstairs in the living room with the doors locked. I turned my gaze towards the wardrobe standing next to the window, watching the door squeak open just a little bit as Patrick checked on me. The hammer in his hand shone in the light of my parents' window. I knew the other hand held a nail. "Right between the eyes," he whispered and smiled at me. His smile did nothing to hide the terror that radiated from his panicked gaze. I nodded towards him. "Right between the eyes," I replied. I leaned back until my head rested against the pillows again and threw a final gaze out into the street. A woman walked the dog on the other side, a bulldog. Its little paws beat the pavement beneath with purpose. "Hello," I thought. I watched the dog until it and its owner turned the corner and disappeared. "Right between the eyes," I thought as I closed my own and waited. Between the eyes, between the eyes, between... The window opened silently, without any effort. The brisk wind of late May in Bucharest blew into my parents' bedroom, and I instantly felt his presence. The scent of cigarettes had stuck with him even in death. I tried not to shiver as the familiar scent of tobacco coated in menthol filled the room. Something touched my hand. A cold, warm material, like leather, dragged across the back of my arm until it hit my wrist. I understood it must have been my father's hand and tried to not recoil as a firm grip was placed around the wrist. But as sharp talons started digging into my skin, I could no longer keep my eyes closed. All resemblance to my father was gone. The strigoi stood taller than he ever was, at least 7 feet, filling the room with its wretched, labored breathing. Its mouth was already open, gums withdrawn close to the bone, making the teeth remaining look sharp and pointed. From its mouth, an elongated spiked tongue peeked between the cracked lips. The strigoi's grip on my wrist hardened, and I saw blood pool beneath the talons that sprouted from its long, scrawny fingers. I swallowed harshly and tried not to scream. A whimper escaped me, and the beast snapped its head in the direction of my face. I wondered if he'd realized I was not my mother, or was he too far gone? The once blue eyes of my father had been replaced with a bloodied red, the only distinguishable part the outer ring of the iris, which glowed with an eerie white. The cheeks were sunken and hollow, the skin broken by early decomposition. What I first had thought to be a slouch due to the low ceiling turned out to be the humped back of the beast, standing like a cancerous mountain beneath the skin. It was the color of aged fat, with bruising and deeper grey all over its skin. Torn shreds of my father's burial suit draped across the concave chest of the unknowable beast. A low, chittering sound escaped its throat, like a cat watching birds through a window, except warped by the degrading skull. Bile rose in my throat as a gurgling noise spat out the ragged tongue between the pointed teeth. "Do it," I thought, as if Patrick could hear me. "Do it, do it, do it!" But nothing happened. The chilling silence in the room filled up with the chittering of the creature standing beside me. The pain in my arm intensified as it turned to face me completely. I felt my soul leave my body, and all I could do was stare as it closed in on my face. Its ragged breath smelled less and less like menthol, and more like dying meat. "Do it," I mumbled in a voice that could not possibly reach the closet. My insides froze as the strigoi's tongue was mere inches from my mouth. I realized Patrick must have been frozen with terror too, and I counted my final seconds. I had, in trying to save my mother, only dragged myself into the same horrendous fate that awaited her after my death. The other claw-like hand of the strigoi traveled up my chest and gripped my shoulders, talons tearing into my flesh. I whimpered loudly, like a terrified puppy, and begged Patrick to get a hold of himself. The spiked tongue stroked my lips, and vomit rose in my mouth. The spikes pried my mouth open, the scent of rot leaving a sheet of horrendous taste all over my tongue. I stared into the abyss that awaited me and settled my debts with God. "Please," I begged him, "don't let me die this way." A thundering roar emitted from the closet, startling both me and the strigoi, which in surprise started withdrawing its tongue from my mouth, ripping the soft flesh of the inside of my cheeks into pieces. My tongue bathed in blood, and I came into a coughing fit as the strigoi ripped its talons from my body. Patrick crashed into it. I felt the warm liquid drip from my lips onto the covers of my parents' bed. Man and beast wrestled beside me for just a moment before the nail found its target. A sickening crack echoed through the space as the nail drove between the eyes of the horrendous monster sprawled across the floor. Patrick stood as the limbs of the strigoi stopped flailing around and came to rest in unnatural positions. He quickly noticed my bleeding face. "I'm sorry, son," he mumbled. "I needed the element of surprise, otherwise it would never have worked." Begrudgingly, I agreed. Every advantage was good, and it had, after all, worked. The inside of my mouth would heal, and so would my arm and my shoulder. The scars on my wrist, however, would be there for the rest of my life. I stared at my father's best friend as he took hold of the legs of the beast and dragged it through the bedroom door. "Close your mouth, boy, we're not done yet." He grunted all the way down the stairs, shouting for my mother to stay in the living room and not to look out into the hallway until the door closed. For what I know, she did as he told her, and was spared the sight of the 7-foot-tall beast my father had become in death. We reburied him the same night, as the wind started to take. He barely fit the coffin anymore. We had to bend him at the knees. My father was buried again the 17th, his face down, so that his soul may find its way to hell and leave us mortals alone. My mother was safe from the curse, and with thanks to Patrick and his trust in my father, lived for another good 20 years. She was buried next to my father, face towards heaven. I'd like to think that's where she ended up, forever spared the sight of what my father's body and soul had become with his passing. I no longer considered myself a happy young man. I have stopped attending my college. I no longer have a girlfriend. I rarely stay in a place for too long, only talk to people if I have to. I always travel by car. The only part left of my old life is Elena. My faithful old pet sticks to my side as I travel around Europe. I mostly live in large towns where an oddity like me is rarely noticed or paid attention to. I never visit the same stores or cafes twice. Self-checkouts have really made things easy for me. My name is Andre, and I'm the last generation of a cursed line of men. If I'm lucky, I will never form a connection with anyone. If I'm lucky, no one will remember me when I die. But if I'm unlucky, the howls of the strigoi will haunt my home again. I know what awaits in the dark.